Hello. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this conversation on Russia's other moves. Other meaning other than what Russia does in Ukraine. As normal and as expected and as it should be, all of the attention is being caught by Ukraine when it comes to military support, when it comes to financial support, when it comes to moral support to the country and its people. And so it should be because it is facing a brutal war started by Russia. But what we are trying to show and to discuss in today's panel, in today's webinar, is Russia's other moves in the region, Russia's other intentions and consequent moves in the region, because the stability of the region rests not only on Ukraine's on a resolution to Ukraine war and to peace in Ukraine, but also to stability and to strength of the other countries in the region. And what Russia has been doing, not lately, but for the last 15 years, at least in the region, is to destabilize other countries, Moldova, Georgia, but not only, other countries in Southern Caucasus as well. And the recent events, both in Moldova and Georgia, are just a reminder of what Russia is doing in countries in the region, and how it is trying to destabilize the countries so it can stop their European path and put an end to their European and transatlantic desire. And to discuss these other events in the region, we have two wonderful speakers: Tamar Kintsurashvili, who is the executive director of the Media Development Fund in Georgia, and Valeriu Pasha, who is a program officer with the Watchdog in Moldova. Thank you very much to both of you for joining. And I will start with you, Tamar, to help us understand a little bit, decipher, if you want, the events in Georgia, the recent events in Georgia that everybody has been obviously following, and also what exactly is going on in Georgia, and what is Russia's actions in the country, and probably to what end we can understand understand the end from where we sit in our respective capitals. But maybe you can explain this to us even a little bit better.
Thank you for inviting me to speak about the problems in region, and particularly in Georgia. As you rightly mentioned, the strategic goal of Russia is to hamper Georgia's integration into Euro-Atlantic space. And in doing so, Russia continues to divide our society, sow fears of the war in light of development in Ukraine, undermine trust in democracy, in democratic institution and its strategic partner. But however, sometimes the actions of local actors are in line with the Kremlin agenda. You mentioned the recent developments when Georgian government passed in first hearing the Russian-style draft law on foreign agent, which aims to discredit the local civil society actors. And the problem is that the government sees the challenge not in information influence operation coming from Russia, rather than in democracy. This is recent development, which is actually creates fruitful ground for Russia's action and undermines our Euro-Atlantic aspiration. And it also makes quite difficult to see Russia's footprint, because when you have local actors messaging the same, spreading same messages, it somehow erodes the perception of threats, because for Georgia, Russia is a security challenge. And it's at the same time, we are witnessing the messages coming from ruling party, attacking our strategic partners, US ambassador, EU ambassador, and they are using the same methods as Russia does. This is instrumentalization of fear of war, saying that if Georgia will support sanctions against Russia, Georgia might experience the same fate as Ukraine. And this is actually, we are witnessing right now when government is offensive against strategic partners, and US and our strategic partners are defensive in their strategic communication, saying nobody tries to drag Georgia into the war. Who is a security threat for Georgia, Russia or US or EU? Countries who support the democratic reforms internally. This is really a challenging issue right now, but I hope the civil society and the Georgian citizens who support Georgia's EU integration will defend our achievements. And Georgia was the role model in this region, but now we are really experiencing quite challenging times.
Thank you, Tamir. So basically, you're describing two important tools, two very subversive tools at the same time: dividing the society, polarizing the society, but also instrumentalization of fear of war, which is not new for Georgia, but it must be more intensive, or even more intensive with the war in Ukraine. Let me go to Valeriu very briefly, and then I'll come back to you, Tamir, again. Is it the same? Are there the same tools that Russia is using in Moldova as well? Dividing the society, instrumentalization of fears of war. Is it going even a little farther in Moldova? And how vulnerable is Moldova?
Hello, thank you for inviting me. Indeed, we encountered similar narratives in Moldova. Russian and pro-Russian actors try to use this fear of war for their strategic goals here, such as discrediting NATO, deterring Moldovan society from supporting security and the defense reform, or simply keeping the political and social life in Moldova polarized and tensioned. But there is much more than it. So we encountered at least 11 key narratives spread by the pro-Russian forces or pro-Russian opinion makers inside Moldova. So they're specifically designed for Moldova. And apart from that, we have the widespread of the narratives produced for Russian core audiences. So almost all of those narratives, such as the fact that actually NATO or the West, so-called collective West, is guilty for the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, or the sole fact that actually Russia is not fighting Ukraine but NATO in Ukraine in this war, and many other are also present. Well, generally, Moldova is more exposed because many topics, such as like open pro-Russian narratives or trying to legitimate Vladimir Putin, for example, for many people in Moldova, that is acceptable. For much more than in Georgia, from what I know, for example. That's why Moldova remains more exposed and very vulnerable to these rhetorics. But of course, disinformation and propaganda is not the only tool used by Russia. They also continue the very harsh economic pressure, which generates obviously political costs, and the economic and social impact of energy blackmail or other type of economic pressure is overwhelmed, is actually multiplied by all this disinformation. So they need to give fuel to their disinformation actors and networks to have topics based on which to attack the government, to attack the West, and so on.
I do want to come back to Tamir, as I was saying, and ask. Actually, I would like to ask both of you the same question, because you did mention a political, among other tools that Russia is using. Both of you mentioned political pressure. At least in Moldova, the financing of certain political parties that support Russia and Russian narratives is very well known, is being made public. It's in the public, not only in Moldova, but all over the world, basically. How about Georgia? How obvious is the financing by Russia of certain political parties, and how strong are actually these parties in Georgia?
Actually, they are not very strong, but the problem is we have the far-right groups who were engaged in violent actions against journalists. They beaten 53 journalists last year during Tbilisi Pride, and none of them were punished, and later they organized a political party. So their funding is not transparent, but the detection of hostile actors also is a problematic in case of Georgia, because Russia learned how to avoid the different policies developed by platforms or by international organizations. And these messages and the media ecosystem, disinformation ecosystem is quite diverse. So in case of Ukraine, they are using so-called credible Western experts who are compromised in the West themselves and serving Putin's interests, personal one. They are also using conservative American platforms such as Fox News and Tucker Carlson, whose videos are translated in Georgian, Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages, and presented as an evidence that this war is between US and Orthodox Russia rather than between Ukraine and Russia. So this is done by the Western actors, using the Western actors rather than Russia Today or Moskovsky Komsomolets. These media outlets are lacking legitimacy because everybody knows that Russia behind them and they are officially sponsored. They are also using deflective source models, so-called cloned websites, cloned CNN or BBC and Western media platforms, knowing that they are more trustful. And they are also using so-called Russian world, Russian diaspora, and immortal regiment groups across the globe to mobilize them not only for dissemination of the false news, but for staging certain actions. We found several instances when they presented the protest of the immortal regiment as a protest of Western countries against Ukraine. So it makes difficult to detect the problem. And in addition, they are using the orthodoxy, and if I have time, I will elaborate how it works in our situation later. So.
I will come back to the role of church. I do want to come back to the role of church because I think it's extremely important and interesting, not only in Georgia and Moldova, but actually throughout the region. Before I turn to Valeriu, though, I do want to remind the participants that you can ask questions in the Q&A section. And if you want to address your question to one of the two speakers, please indicate which speaker this is addressed. The question is addressed to. So, Valeriu, financing of political parties by Russia in Moldova.
Yeah, it didn't stop. And here the big challenge is the inefficient and corrupt justice system of Moldova. Which is unable to, which is not willing to prevent this shady financing. But anyway, the special services, the government took some actions to reduce the possibilities for this info ops to run, to be financed, without a very big impact. But we already see that at least they have some shortages in cash distribution, because usually they simply move packages of cash around the country and distribute to the local branches of the political parties. They hire or bribe, better saying, participants for pro-Russian meetings and stuff like this. What's also important to keep in mind is that despite all this propaganda and intense financing by Russia and its allies, the kleptocratic groups headed by fugitive oligarchs such as Ilan Shor or Vladimir Plakhatnyuk, they didn't get a public support for this protest. Coming back to the parties, there is a very intense competition between pro-Russian political forces in Moldova. The Russian operatives who are responsible for all these political operations in Moldova, in my perception, are quite confused because they were looking for some new approaches even before the large-scale invasion, and they started to implement the one. Actually, very recently, we had an investigation signed by Rise Moldova, Dossier Center, Yahoo News. So it was an international network of journalists who obtained actually the strategy of Russia of how to erode the support for the new pro-European government, which was established after the 2021 elections. And in my perception, they also diversified the approach. So they started to invest not only in openly pro-Russian politicians, but also in those who pretend to be pro-European, which is something new for Moldova, at least for the last 15 years. In my perception, the exponents of this type of approach are the ex-Prime Minister Ion Chicu or the actual mayor of Chisinau, Ion Ceban. And what's the saddest in this situation is that it looks like there are not very few politicians in the West, including in Romania, who became kind of victims of this chameleon strategy. So the money continued to flow. There is a harsh competition now between Ilan Shor and Party of Socialists of who will be the beloved partner of Putin in Moldova. It looks like Ilan Shor is more successful, but the competition is still there. Unfortunately, we have a confirmation of the legitimacy or a general rule which we detected in an analysis back in 2019, that it is always influence on invitation. So there are Moldovan politicians who will offer their services to Kremlin to become Kremlin puppets in Moldova. It's never a kind of recruitment from Kremlin when they are looking who is the potentially successful politician in Moldova. There is a harsh competition between different politicians to go to Moscow and say, hey, please support us. Give us money, give us political support. We are ready to repeat all your propaganda, but please just support us. And now it is Ilan Shor, Party of Communists, Party of Socialists, the ex-Prime Minister Chicu, the actual mayor of Chisinau, even if he tries to present himself as a pro-European. There is the current chief of the Gagauzian autonomy, Irina Vlach. There are a bunch of smaller political parties and activists, including in Gagauzian autonomy. All of them are competing to become the main pro-Russian project. This is important to keep in mind, I think.
But has their number increased since the war? Because you mentioned names which, you know, they've been around for years and everybody knows they're Russian
Yeah,
puppets.
actually, their number didn't grow for sure. It looks like we had in the whole society the number of those who were like, okay, yeah, we are pro-European, but pro-Russian too, so they have a kind of this very loyal attitude toward Russia. So they switched to become very critical and against this Russian aggression, including toward Moldova, because now, for the first time in the history of the country, the whole leadership of the country finally recognizes that Moldova is the target of a hybrid war, and the source of this war is Russia, and Russia is officially a threat. So this is a unique, and for the first time it happens. Unfortunately, it didn't happen in the second day of the large-scale invasion. It took some time, the new government and the president of Moldova to understand and recognize for the public these obvious realities.
Well, Russia has intensified its military threats to Moldova as well. So now it is really difficult not to say that Russia is a threat to Moldova. Let me go back to Tamir. I do want to ask each of you two more questions, and then we'll turn. I know there is a question in the Q&A section. But I do want to come back, or rather talk about the role of church, the role of Orthodox Church in Georgia.
Actually,
please don't take the full day. I know you can talk for a full day about this, but they don't have the full day.
Actually, the church plays a crucial role in other parts of the world, because this Russian world concept tries to consolidate the so-called Russian world, which is not only Russians, ethnically Russians, but the people united by common belief and common thinking, as Putin himself mentioned, people who speak, think, and feel Russian. So there are two main topics for consolidation. This is shared religion, common religion, and shared history. That's why they are using the celebration of 9 May and the victory on the Nazis, the Second World War, and present this war as a great war. And the second is religion, because I mentioned the case when the Tucker Carlson presented some statements of the US senator on the anti-feminist and the human rights Russia, and interpreted this world as a fight against Orthodox Russia. In this concept, Moscow is presented as a third Rome who tries to defend us from pervert West. So this false dilemma and the fear of losing identity is most influential instrument of Kremlin, alongside fear of war, because fear of war is something very natural. And when it concerns our identity, people are more impulsive, less rational, and it's quite difficult to address this issue only with fact-checking, because it's psychological operation. And right now, what is happening with the church in Ukraine, they are using same divisive narratives. And I think it requires whole society approach and improvement of educational system, which is challenging, because sometimes these old style teachers are under influence of Orthodox Church, and they are against the critical thinking, which is necessary skills in media literacy. And sometimes populist leaders are using also this vulnerability in society for domestic purposes. So it's quite complex issue, and it requires a whole society approach to address.
Valeriu?
Well, in Moldova, well, obviously, church has its role. It generally perpetuates this anti-liberal discourse. but Moldovan Orthodox Church is not very aggressive in this regard. So they are not very active. Yeah, for example, I can compare to the situation 10 years ago or even 8 years ago. There were several groups in the Moldovan metropoly, which is part of the Russian patriarchy, who were quite present. Now they are not that present. So yes, they support many of these Russian narratives, but not that aggressive. Yes, the Moldovan church didn't openly blame Russia for aggression, but they are not endorsing, and we don't see kind of active propaganda in every church. For example, like the Orthodox Church in Romania is much more aggressive in promoting anti-Western discourses than the Moldovan Orthodox Church of the Russian Patriarchy. So they are just lazy. There are many decent people inside it who are simply not endorsing this or not ready to. Yes, there are singular cases, but this is not a systemic work. So like religious topics, related to the faith, to the orthodoxy, are much more often used by politicians than by representatives of church priests or high-level hierarchs. Yeah, that is what we have in mind.
Let me take this question, which goes to Tamar from what I can see, and then I'll continue with my own questions. Tamar, there are Stratcom departments established in many government institutions, and they are usually trained and funded by Georgia's Western partners to fight Russian disinformation. However, what we see in return is that the political leadership of those institutions is an extension of the sources of Russian disinformation themselves. What should be done to address this oxymoron?
Thank you for this question. This is really problematic and goes back to the recent developments in Georgia, because really our Western partners helped the Georgian government to develop infrastructure to counter Russian disinformation of hostile countries. However, these platforms are mostly used against critical media outlets, civil society actors. In addition, recently, ruling party developed its own fact-checking platform, undermining the notion of democracy itself, criticizing, for instance, the media outlets for requesting the information from the parliament, which is oxymoron itself. I think the Western partners should acknowledge this problem, first of all, because their taxpayer money are spent on discrediting the critical voices and democratic institutions. There are, of course, a problem of the quality of media reporting in our society, like in any other, but Stratcoms are not the complaint commission of the charters of ethics or something like this. We have institutional mechanisms to discuss these issues. For us, the threat is coming from Russia. Information operations are more problematic rather than violation of balance or lacking some sources or manipulative reporting in the politically affiliated media outlets, which is not as huge problem as cyber attack, for instance, or Lugar Lab, and leak of documents, scientific document, which is not investigated properly. And when we request information about this development, there is purely silence. This is overall policy of current government not to irritate Russia publicly. And there is a gap in public discourse filled by pro-Kremlin parties saying not Russia, but Turkey is occupier, because 1 century ago, part of Georgia were occupied by Turkey, but in current context, it is not as problematic. It's destructive strategy blaming all our neighbors except of Russia. So saying Azerbaijan tries to take our Orthodox churches, Armenians are enemies, Turks are enemies. By the way, pro-Kremlin actors are saying right now that defeat of Russia in this war poses threat to Georgia because Russia is the only country who can defend Georgia from Turkish threats and its imperial actually intentions, and to protect us from Muslim countries. So in this context, we are lacking the government who consolidates all actors against foreign interventions and Russian information influence. However, government is not our partner in this battle, unfortunately, like it happens in Baltic countries, like it's in Ukraine. We are ready to consolidate around our government, but we see the problem in perception of the problem. We think that poor journalistic reporting is not good, but the Russian information operations are causing more harm to our security rather than biased reporting in opposition-affiliated media outlets.
You mentioned a very interesting narrative, which I haven't come across, at least not in this part of this part of the region, in the western part of the region, which is that everybody, all of your neighbors actually are your enemies except for Russia. And if Russia is defeated, that means that all of these other neighbors will start taking pieces of Georgia. Valeriu, how strong is the narrative that the neighbors of Moldova, Romania being obviously the main one, are in fact Moldova's enemies, and that Russia's defeat will lead to disintegration of Moldova, or whatever the narrative goes?
Well, it is particularly strong. Well, again, this is not something new for Moldova. It is a narrative spread by Russian and pro-Russian actors from even before the independence of Moldova, when the period of obtaining the independence started in the late 80s. Especially it's strong in Gagauzia. It is, of course, strong in Transnistria. It is quite connected to the this scary of unification of Moldova with Romania, which is presented as a potential threat to ethnic minorities. But it is not that strong as it is now in Georgia, because it's not regional anymore. In 30 years, it doesn't have that high impact on the society. But generally, we have a kind of alternative narrative, which is widespread, that Ukraine and the West is trying to grab Moldova in the war against Russia, and that the government is provoking Russia. It's a kind of use of blaming Ukraine, blaming Romania, blaming the West. We had a lot of these conspiracy stories that Romania, together with Moldovan government, is preparing a military operation, and of course with Ukraine in Transnistria. And it appeared first time in the April of 2022. Recently, it was relaunched. So this is the Moldovan counterpart of the same story, I would say.
Let's take another question from the audience. Returning back to the church in Georgia and Moldova, has the church the right to establish schools, hospitals, other kind of social institutions, or participate in business activities?
Actually, in Georgia, we have special agreement in constitution with Orthodox Church. They have tax exemption. They have right to establish schools and develop some businesses. But as Valeriu mentioned, but our Orthodox Church also voiced the same messages I mentioned about the pervert versus Orthodox Russia, but the same messages are spread through different actors, political parties, pro-Russian media outlets, far-right groups, and even by some government proxies or some government representatives in certain cases. And it's mostly related also to human rights, gender issues, because it's conflict versus open society versus closed society, sometimes new legislative amendments defending women's rights are presented as an interference in actually domestic issues and attempts to destroy traditional family. Moreover, sometimes the protest in favor, we had one instance when Georgians were protesting when the Iranian activists were killed after moral police sanctioned her. And anti-Western actors are voicing messages that Iran defending, there is no violation of women's rights in Iran, but this protest is staged by US because US has its political agenda. Any issues related to human rights might be interpreted by these hostile actors either in political context or in terms of identity-related issues, traditions, etc.
Valeriu, do you want to answer this question as well?
The church in Moldova has the right to establish hospitals or schools, but I never heard about any case. The church in Moldova has a very specific legal status. It's an almost NGO, but with a kind of special need for special registration in order to avoid like extremist movements. If they can run businesses, actually most of the churches, but especially monasteries in Moldova are businesses. They are running, well, they are not paying taxes, that's a problem, but they are quite business oriented, yes.
Yeah, I think it's the same. It's the same all over the region, with the church having a special status when it comes to tax exceptions and benefits as well. I do have a question. I have two more questions, and then I'll go back to the audience if there are more questions. The first question is about the Russian diaspora. I don't know who mentioned, either one of you mentioned Russian diaspora. What is the role of this new Russian diaspora, the Russians who are fleeing, who are leaving Russia because of the war, because of drafting, actually? What is the role of the Russian diaspora, of this new Russian diaspora in Georgian politics, if any?
Actually, role of new diaspora in Georgia is not investigated and studied yet. When I was speaking about diaspora, I was meaning the Russian diaspora globally abroad. We have some partnership with Facebook, and after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, we started fact-checking in Russian language, having access to data virally reported in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. So we identified many Facebook pages and groups abroad in Canada, in different parts of the world, even in the global south, different Immortal Regiment movement. So I was meaning their mobilization. In Georgian case, there is no data yet available, how many people are crossing the borders, because you can feel when you are walking in the streets that Russians, especially in prestigious part of Tbilisi, are leaving and moving from Russia. but there is no study so far, and they are quiet, at least at this stage. There are some groups who are working with them, but they have no significant influence. What I can share my personal observation in supermarkets or daily basis, they are avoiding to speak in Russian. Mostly they are speaking in English, but their accent is notable. So in this regard.
That's a very interesting subject. Maybe German Marshall Fund can look a little bit into this issue, because it's very interesting. Valeriu, do you have the same? Well, I presume the Russian diaspora is much smaller in Moldova, but do you have the same issues?
No, there is no any significant increase of Russian diaspora in Moldova after the start. We don't have a joint border. We don't have, well, otherwise Moldova probably would be invaded even before Ukraine. And we didn't have for a while the direct flights. There was a relatively significant number of Moldovans who established or temporarily worked in Russia, so they came back home. Most of them are actually already gone to work in the West. This is a kind of very natural process, which didn't start now. We had a huge wave after 2014. Yes, that was significant. Now it's not that important. Few cases, particularly I can mention, for example, the case of Russian political technologist Marat Gelman, who suddenly remembered that he originates from Moldova. He came back, and unfortunately, there are a lot of important people in Moldovan political establishment who continue to think in this very colonial way. And they started to go with this Gelman all around, and I found him at the Ministry of Culture, and he came once and twice, and I found that he's almost writing the new culture development strategy for Moldova, and including myself, then said, hey, please, sorry, not the friends of Kirienko will design our cultural development priorities. And that's too much. But this is one particular case was this so-called liberal Russians. And I say so-called because the person has nothing with the true liberalism. And the one who posts on Facebook that Putin became a criminal only after February 24th, 2022 is not the one whom I'm ready to defend. So it is not a factor. And I think this is a positive. Yes. It didn't bring that economic, relatively positive impact, which is felt in Georgia, and the impact is important. But again, I don't think that the general population of Georgia feels very much these improvements. But Moldova is very vulnerable already with a lot of Russian agents here. We don't need potential new.
Let me take a question from the audience, which is actually about the separatist regions. Can the speakers talk about the situation in separatist regions like Transnistria, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia? What kind of message about the war are Moscow and local authorities promoting? And do you know what local populations in these regions think about this news? Valeriu, why don't you start, because you are unmuted anyway?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that the situation in the breakaway regions in Georgia is very different from Transnistria. Transnistria as a whole became very silent and very scared in the first day of Russian large-scale invasion. We didn't see any important manifestations even in the first days of this, that, hey, our friends and brothers are coming. No. Most important reaction of the people in Transnistria was the fact that they were authorities, so-called authorities there, have a diverse reaction. Why? Because the political elite in Transnistria is divided. in two unproportional parts. There is one biggest, controlled by this business holding Sharif, which is totally against, becoming part of Russia, because all these people understand that the first fact or the first decisions of Russians will be to substitute local business and political elites with other people who will come from Russia or with local marginal elements such as Motorola, Pushilin, and other unlikely political leaders.
Do you have any information, Valeriu, or can you tell us something about the population of Transnistria? How do they,
Yeah, I'll just
relate
end
to the war?
With the political elite, but there is also a part which is controlled directly by Russia. First of all, so-called special services, who are organizing these fake terroristic acts and other sometimes scary, sometimes funny stories from Transnistria. The population, of course, population is very much exposed and trusts the propaganda of Russian TV because it's widespread in Transnistrian region. In the same time, so they try to legitimate Russia to a certain degree more than, for example, in the other part of Moldova. But they are not aggressive supporters. So these are not people who are ready to take the weapons. Even people who work in the so-called military or police in that region are not that aggressive supporters. Unfortunately, we don't have kind of objective figures to measure people's reactions there. We are trying now to find a specific project to at least to run one opinion poll there, because it's not easy to organize it, but it is generally possible. What I feel is that people in Transnistrian region are less pro-Russian, for example, than the people in Gagauzia, which is part of Moldova and controlled by, like, allegedly controlled by constitutional authorities. So it's not that that linear that it is controlled by Russian army. That's why they are all pro. No, people there are very scared. For example, last year in May, when the local KGB, on the demand of FSB, of course, mocked some terroristic attacks, thousands of people started to run away from Transnistria. And they were running to the right bank of Dniester, where they have, most of them, or very many of them, have friends, relatives. So the people-to-people contacts remained very strong between Moldova and Transnistrian region. I mean, the rest of Moldova and Transnistria region.
Tamir, how about Abkhazia and South Ossetia?
Actually, we have limited people-to-people contacts with these occupied regions. But in terms of the war, it's quite sensitive issue because mobilization concerns these two parts, as we see that from Sputnik coverage, and there are some victims and they are sacrificing their lives. Otherwise, in terms of messaging, they are under direct influence of Russian sources. And this war is presented as a war of the West against Russia. So they are associating their security with Russia. They are economically dependent on Russia, and recent development and sanctions are also problematic for those two regions. In addition to Russian occupied territories, I would like to mention also Samtskhe in Georgia, which is densely populated with Armenian ethnic minorities. In this case, we also see direct Russian propaganda because of language barriers. They are more dependent on direct Kremlin sources. And we have done some study in this region, which indicates that they are directly consuming first channel news about the Ukrainians actually staging some scenarios and sacrificing the victims, sacrificing their own people, and presenting that this war against the war of Nazis against Russia who tried to defend the Russian population in Ukraine. We see the direct correlation between the official Russian channels messaging and their perception of the war, and this region is not covered probably by Georgian national TV channels. So this is also problematic when we are talking about the information protection of information space in Georgia.
We have one more question from the audience, which goes to both of you. From what I understand, yes, it goes to both of you. What actions of EU have been most successful to counter Russia's influence in Moldova and Georgia?
I think
Valeriu?
Yeah.
Tamir, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was visa-free travel and people-to-people contact, first of all, because it's the best way to see what kind of West we are integrating, what is our perspective, and to see the better life and how to improve condition of life and how to integrate and communicate with the Western families. In addition, I think the youth programs, because youth are actively engaged in different activities and there are peer-to-peer communication and joint projects. I think it was very productive, and we have seen these protests several months ago in Tbilisi, demonstrating the will of Georgian people that they want to return in European family.
Valeriu?
Great question. Well, generally, European Union have done a lot of different actions: financial support, political support, logistical support, technical support, expertise, to help Moldova to remain stable, to prevent all these destabilization attempts by the Russia and Russian allies here. But I'm not ready to use the word efficient together with the actions of European Union, because I do not consider them efficient. Having in mind the huge investment like financial support by the European Union, it is that much disproportionately neglecting the soft power component. The investment in the punctual counteract of the disinformation and other hybrid threats. So I'm not ready to call it efficient. Altogether, having in mind the the mass of the money of other efforts paid, yes, it had an important impact, but it could have a bigger impact, a better impact, even with less financial investments.
You're connecting impact to the level of investment, or you're connecting impact to the power, to the strength of the message?
Both. Well, it's not about the message. We received a lot of messages. I'm saying about actions. For example, we could move much more much quicker on the energy independence and energy security, on the logistical interconnection. I don't see European Union behaving as a union or as a entity which understands that it is a war here. So I don't see actions which are typical for the wartime. This is what I said. And European Union could do much more on that, including even in peaceful time to invest. And I'm talking also about financial inputs, much more in the soft issues. There is just one example. 1 or 2 new kilometers of road repaired in Moldova will cost 2-3 million euro, and it will not change at least 1% of people's support for the West or for Russia. Similar money invested, for example, in the new powerful Russian language media tool, which will combat actively the Russian disinformation, can change a lot in one single year. And we're hearing so many concerns about Russian pressure and hybrid threats and so on and so on. And so disproportionately law done specifically to tackle these type of challenges that, again, I don't say that nothing is done. There are some actions, but I'm not ready to call it efficient.
Is Moldova on a tipping point? I mean, we have been witnessing Moldova going back and forth for the last 20 years at least. Is Moldova on a tipping point?
I'm not ready to declare that I'm 100% confident that it is in one direction or another. But generally now we have a much better situation than probably in last 20 years. Our recent opinion polls show that we have inside Moldova 59% of those who say they would vote for the integration of European in the European Union, instead of only 23% of those who say they prefer Eurasian Union. The difference is the biggest in the period we are measuring it in last, I think it's around 10 years, 10, 11 years. And it looks like a switch, but I'm not ready to say this is irreversible. It depends on the next elections. It depends on economy. Well, first of all, of course, it depends on the battlefield of the war of Russia in Ukraine. Yeah, so let's not forget about this factor.
So it's not irreversible. That is the answer to the question. That is the said answer to the question.
Yes,
Tamir,
I'm not ready
change?
to say it's irreversible. Yeah.
Right. Tamir, is there any change in Georgia on the horizon?
It's unclear with current situation because Georgia failed to receive candidacy status alongside Ukraine, Moldova because of democracy challenges, especially with judiciary. Recently, U.S. government sanctioned some Georgian lawyers. And there was outcry from the ruling party. They are not admitting the problem, and moreover, they are not attending parliamentary sessions when opposition initiated to launch investigative commission. So the problem is about the slide back in terms of democracy, which might affect the foreign policy of the country. So we have very unpredictable situation. We are more optimistic after this protest because the law on foreign agent, the intention was to discredit all the independent actors, independent from the government. So it's not clear right now the development. Now we will see what happens with candidacy status. This window of opportunity is open for Georgia, and it's good momentum for us. We acknowledge that we should use this opportunity, but when we have the general director of opposition TV channel imprisoned, this questions democratic aspiration of the current government, and if EU actually closes its eyes on these such issues as independence, the freedom of media, it legitimizes the current situation rather than help us to enjoy the democratic achievements of European family. I have
So there is
answer.
no change on the horizon, basically. There
Yes.
is no change on the immediate horizon. That's okay. That's another said answer to the question.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We are right on the hour. I don't want to close before mentioning an idea. This is a suggestion rather than a question. I will take it as a suggestion. Also from the audience. From the soft power perspective, what about the idea of a joint corporation across the 3 Seas region to create high-quality Russian language programming, news, sports, entertainment that is Western-oriented? I think it's an interesting idea. Maybe it could get somewhat to the 3 Seas summit, because I think that's where such an idea belongs. I don't see it as a bad idea at all. No, thank you very much. It's been extremely interesting. I think. Go ahead, Valeriu.
Just want to add, because this is particularly valuable. So this is, thank you, Nathan, for this suggestion. Actually, if you find the possibility, please contact me. We proposed something similar almost 4 years ago, when unfortunately it wasn't that much understood. We discussed it with USA, with other, and when I see this 3C, I understand first of all Baltic, Black, Caspian Sea, and it is something really needed. It is very important. We are now developing a new project to life. It is needed. We need to offer to our ethnic minorities something alternative. And the regional project obviously is something which will work much better.
Well, thank you again. I think for me, at least, it's been very interesting. I hope it's been interesting for the audience as well. We went through almost all, not quite all, but almost all of the Russian tools that it uses in Moldova and Georgia and other countries. A lot of what you are describing happens in other countries in the region. Maybe not to the same extent, but it does happen to other countries in the region. Thank you very much. Thank you to those in the audience, and the best of luck from now on. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.